Chapter 16 of Abandoned by William Clark Russell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gary Ullman. Abandoned by William Clark Russell. Chapter 16. Husband and wife. The Deal solicitor was punctual in sending Captain Reynolds his will. It was witnessed by the manager of the hotel and the bookkeeper, to both of whom, of course, Reynolds remained John Goodhart, Esquire, because, as a rule, testators do not read aloud the contents of their wills to the people who attest them. The possession of this will made Reynolds very happy. Happen what might to him, Lucretia would be provided for, and though they should never come together as husband and wife, he was still, though masquerading as Mr. Goodhart, the Frank Reynolds of her choice and denial, who would watch over her and provide for her by such expedients as love, such honourable and such noble love as his, is very cunning. 2 days after he had taken the drive with Lucretia, he went to London and called at his bank, where he had a short interview with the manager, who wrote and signed a cheque upon the bank that was countersigned by the accountant. He returned from London by a late train, and next morning took lodgings in the Augusta Road, so that by looking out of the window he could see the house in which Lucretia lived. After lunch he strolled out with the hope of meeting her. He returned to his rooms and wrote this note. I was in London yesterday and had good news for you. As you seem to have an aversion to invitations to dinner, would you drink tea with me this evening at 5:30? Yours sincerely, John Goodhart. As before, when he scrawled a letter to her in his bed, he wrote with studious ambition of concealment in handwriting, and was as successful in this art as in nature. He was a triumph in his representation of Goodhart. Within half an hour, a note was left at his lodgings. Mrs. Reynolds would do herself the pleasure to drink tea with Mr. Goodhart. She came with the punctuality that was one of the graces of her characteristics. Is it necessary to describe her dress? Close-fitting navy blue serge and a sailor hat. The weather was sultry, and she was pale and carried a fan. A lovely bouquet of flowers stood upon the table and refreshed the atmosphere with the incense of half a score of different growths of beauty. The window was still open, but the road was a quiet one, and the lace curtains effectually screened the occupants of the room from the inspection of the profane and vulgar passer-by, who, with a packet of shrimps in his pocket, which he picks at and eats as he rolls along, his hard hat on the back of his head, and his legs travelling somewhat tipsily in a pair of check trousers of a pattern so enormous that a giant of 15 feet high could not reduce the eyesore to the proportion, holds Ramsgate to be after Margate the only place in all of England to do himself proud in, with what he calls a outing. They had not met since the day of the carriage drive, but neither exhibited embarrassment. She was too self-possessed to be disturbed by a feeling that, like naivety, may be defined in the Frenchman's expression as une nuance de base presque demas d'elevation, whilst he found all the fortitude he needed in the circumstance of his being her husband. You have not gone very far, said she, sitting and fanning herself and looking at the flowers on the table. No, I can easily see where you live. What glorious flowers! I was sure you would think them worth the trouble of carrying home. Thanks so much. They will grace my poor room. It needs it. No one will say that whilst you are its occupant. He rang the bell for tea. Have you found any afternoon pupils? Not yet. I have put an advertisement this week in a Ramsgate paper. I have some news for you, but I'll wait till the servant has come and gone. She looked about the room and said, Won't you find it very dull here after life in a hotel? I dislike life in a hotel, as Dickens the writer your husband admired so greatly, truly says. In a hotel nobody is glad to see you, nor cares how long you stop or where you go. You become a number. You lose individuality and are changed into a particle in a stream of figures in a ledger. You can't enjoy seclusion unless you invoke the genius of insolvency and establish yourself in a set of private apartments from a price which yield a comfortable income apiece to 4 or 5 vicars, and beyond the most strenuously exerted earning power of even a popular country medical practitioner, to a price which, if an American girl had it in the shape of a weekly revenue, would buy her a British lord or an Italian prince. Now in lodgings you can dine off a chop, smoke a pipe, drink stout from the public house, humour the landlady's cat, and live through the life of the day without that critical inspection from which all human beings suffer in the public rooms of hotels and boarding houses. And then Mrs. Reynolds' lodgings may be cheap. It was manifest to him, even whilst he spoke, that the attention with which she accompanied the movements of his lips was due, not to the amenable desire to be amused, but to something lying very much deeper. When he ceased, she exclaimed, "If my husband had been pleading on behalf of lodgings against hotels, he would have put his views just as you have, in the same spirit. I might declare in the very same words." "Very likely," said Reynolds, quietly, looking at the tea-tray, which the servant was then placing on the table. But his answer would not do. She was troubled. She directed at him a scrutiny that made her frown. Her toe tapped the carpet, and she looked down. "Will you give me a cup of tea?" She drew to the table and filled 2 cups in silence. But 3 or 4 times whilst she did this, she darted her brilliant gaze at him. His breathing grew a trifle laboured, the motions of his heart a little swifter. He believed that her mind was at the very touch-hole of detection, and he waited for the flash and what was to follow. The flash. But the suspicion that discoloured and even in its way distorted her beauty soon dissolved. Under the warm breath of conviction. Indeed, she never had supposed, she never could suppose, the man who confronted her to be her husband. He was an Australian. His wife lay buried in Sydney. He had come to hear of Captain Reynolds by one of the 100 accidents of the sea. He had not her husband's face, nor his voice, nor his enunciation. And if Frank had been alive, though 8 years, why did he return now? Why not earlier? She drew a breath that had the depth of a suspicion and said, "It is very strange." "Coincidences are strange," he answered, breathing easily again. "I never allow them to weigh. They resemble dreams. We remember the 2 or 3 that came to pass and forget the thousands that vanished unverified." She seems to acquiesce in this opinion by an inclination of her head. He looked at her and thought to himself, "It is wonderful that, loving her as I find I do, as deeply as I loved her when I married her, I should have waited 8 years to return and seek her. But Goodhart was right. I did not know myself." He pulled out a pocketbook. "I was in London yesterday," he said. "And what about your business?" "The bank is satisfied with my representations, and the information I obtained from Lloyd's and other sources as to Captain Reynolds, and I have much pleasure in handing to you this cheque, the balance of the money your husband left at the bank before he sailed." He extended an envelope with a large official red wax seal. It was addressed to Mrs. Reynolds, care of John Goodhart, Esquire. She broke open the envelope and withdrew the cheque that was folded in a sheet of paper, on which was lithographed with the manager's compliments. The cheque was for £218. She coloured, her eyes brightened. Gratitude sweetened her beauty with the tender, smiling light with which that gentle and lovely quality casts upon the face. "How am I to thank you, Mr. Goodhart? I should never have heard of this, or thought of it, but for you." He raised his hand in a cordial gesture of remonstrance. £218, she explained. Why, this and the money you brought to me from the islands are a fortune. I feel rich. How good of you." She paused, and looking at the cheque said, with a sudden sorrow in her tone, a sudden sorrow in look, "Poor Frank." He fastened his gaze upon the ground, for he knew just then that there was a dangerous moisture in his eyes, and not for the life of him durst he have spoken. Her "poor Frank" had struck to his heart, and for a moment or two the man wept inwardly. "To whom shall I send a receipt for this cheque?" she inquired after a welcome interval of thought. "Acknowledge it to me, and I will forward your letter to the bank," he answered, managing his voice by speaking low. She asked no more questions. It did not occur to her to inquire how it happened that the bank should pay over
Captain
her husband's
Francis
money
Reynolds
to a stranger
was dead.
without her authority. How Mr. Goodhart had succeeded in satisfying the law, and sequentially the bank.
That Captain Francis Reynolds was dead.
Mr. Goodhart had behaved most nobly and honourably, and the money was a godsend. "Will you give me another cup of tea, Mrs. Reynolds?" She put the cheque in her pocket. He took the cup from her. A smile was gracious as she handed it to him. The distressed poet, scratching verses under a map of the gold mines of El Dorado, done by his wife and the milkman, may, and as a matter of fact does, call money dross, filthy lucre, and the like. But there seems to exist in this dross an inherent property of such electrical vitality that, when applied, it will force laughter from anguish, illume the sickliest countenance, inform with a passion of dance the gout itself, and liberate the virtues from the webs into which the spider poverty coaxes them to roll them up. "By the way," said Reynolds, looking up from some notes he had made on a piece of paper, "did you ever meet a man named Featherbridge?" "The man, I mean," continued Reynolds, "sailed with your husband as chief mate of the Flying Spur." "Yes, I knew him. Indeed, he acted as my husband's best man at our marriage." She spoke in a wary way, as though she distrusted this subject. Suddenly her mood burst into impassioned life, and she cried, "Why do you ask if I know Mr. Featherbridge? Is he alive? Have you met him? Have you news of my husband?" He had by this time wholly mastered himself. "I was in a city yesterday," he said, "and turned into some dining rooms near the Mansion House for lunch. I took a seat opposite a man who, after viewing me a while, pronounced my name. I immediately recollected him. He was Mr. Charles Hall, member of a firm of London shipbrokers. He had sailed with me as a passenger in a vessel I commanded. We fell into a conversation, and it was natural, perhaps, that our talk should have large reference to the sea. He told me that in all his experience he never remembered so many ships posted as missing. I can scarcely tell you how it came about, but in speaking of missing ships, he mentioned the Flying Spur, in whose fate he was interested, as his firm had negotiated the sale of her to the person who owned her when your husband obtained command. I told him that I had the pleasure of knowing the widow of Captain Reynolds. "Indeed," said he, "that's strange. Reynolds' chief mate was a Mr. Featherbridge, whose mother lives where I do, a pleasant old lady, whom my wife and I have been acquainted with for many years. The last letter Mrs. Featherbridge ever received from her son was dated at Madeira, where the ship had called. Did you hear from your husband at Madeira?" "No," she answered. "It was a long letter," Mr. Hall said, "and it was nearly all about Captain Reynolds and you." Lucretia slightly coloured, but remained silent. "Shall I proceed, Mrs. Reynolds? I don't want to pain you, but I believe that whatever concerned your husband after his departure would interest you, and so I took down some notes. I took down some notes of Mr. Hall's conversation to help my memory. If it is your wish that I should tell you what Mr. Featherbridge wrote to his mother, I should be glad to hear," she said distantly. He returned to his notes. "You were living with your mother in Bayswater when you were married. After your marriage you locked yourself up in your bedroom and refused to see, to speak to, or to have anything whatever to do with Captain Reynolds. It is very wonderful that Mr. Hall should remember the contents of a letter all about a stranger so very, very accurately," exclaimed Lucretia, darkly, nervously, suspiciously, as though she thought that Mr. Goodhart had something of the devil in him. He removed his glasses to polish them. Whenever he was without spectacles or a pince nez, the dull ball of the left eye, lustreless, stained and veined like those marbles boys call alleys, hallowed by a sort of arceus senilis, these and the wrinkles where he had wounded himself, the scar, the deflected arch of an eyebrow, utterly changing the character of the face, were very visible and instantly took the eye. "I certainly shall not go on if I annoy you, but I thought that, knowing what your feelings are for your husband, the latest news of him down to vanishing point, for he disappears afterward as a soap bubble explodes, would interest you." "It does, but you can't say he disappears. You brought news of him from the island, news that is later than this Featherbridge letter that was posted, you say, at Madeira. Oh, that island news is very negative news. Its report is merely that Captain Reynolds was on the island, conceived himself dying, nailed all he was worth to the lid of a sea chest with an appeal to the honour of the stranger who found it to hand it to you, and then we must suppose that one day or night he stiffened his spine and, looking up to God, passed out. That's not the news I got from Mr. Hall. There is no reason to believe that my husband is dead, because he was not seen on the island by the officer you sent on shore," she exclaimed, with temper in her eyes and voice. "Shall I go on?" he asked. "Oh, certainly," she replied, in a large, sarcastic, bland manner. He resumed the spectacles and seemed to consider his notes. Featherbridge told his mother that he had helped Captain Reynolds to decoy his wife to the ship, so I gathered from Hall. But his aversion was so violent, so menacing to Reynolds' character among the crew, that in despair he sent her ashore at Falmouth and proceeded on his voyage alone. Hall told me that Featherbridge, who appeared to have been a gentleman and a man of education, described your husband's grief as a form of sorrow that affected him more than any sort of human misery he had witnessed. He forsook his food, his cheeks fell in, he would often in pacing halt and stand rooted and gaze at the sea in an agony of mind, and once he clutched Featherbridge by the arm and looked him in the face with his swimming eyes, and after such a groan as a man gives whose heart breaks, whose spirit flies, whose whole moral being falls into ruin, he cried, "Oh, my God, what have I done that she, the one, the only love of my life, my own, my beautiful, my dearest wife, what have I done that she should abandon me?" Lucretia shrieked and sprang to her feet. "I can endure no more. I cannot indeed. You will drive me madder than I then was. No more, I beg." She brought her foot to the ground with a stamp that shook the ornaments on the mantelpiece, and fanned herself with extravagant motions. He pocketed his glasses and his notes, and put on his pince-nez, and as she was standing, he stood. "It is too much," he exclaimed, with mounting colour and enlarged nostril, an eye dramatized into a fine expression of wrath and beauty by her spirit's adjustment of the mobile lid, lash, and brow, "that a matter so sacred and personal to myself as the relations between my husband and me should be talked about in a London eating-house." "Nothing of the sort, Mrs. Reynolds. Mr. Hall and I sat apart. He spoke of you and your husband in terms of sympathy. I'm sure you would appreciate Mr. Featherbridge." "I hated that man," burst out Lucretia. "He could look you in the face and tell you a lie. Mr. Featherbridge," continued Reynolds, approaching her by a step or two and keeping his eyes steadily bent upon hers, "referred to you in his letter as one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen, and he declared himself utterly at a loss to understand why you, who did undoubtedly love your husband well enough to marry him, should immediately after the marriage find something in the man of your choice, this comely, honourable sailor who adored you, to excite the loathing that broke his heart and widowed you. She fanned herself furiously. When he ceased to speak, a deep blush burned her face. The sting of the blood was insupportable. She went to the open window and turned her back upon him. But after a brief interval, without moving her figure, she looked sideways and said, "How dared that man, Featherbridge, say that? I loathed my husband. Well, Mrs. Reynolds, I trusted that the very last news of your husband that could be given would interest you. I hope, despite my clumsy method of communicating it, we still remain friends." He saw her swaying as she stood. In an instant she was in his arms in a swoon. He carried her to the sofa, laid her upon it, removed her hat, eased her neck, fanned her. If ever human love spoke in gesture and face, it was to be interpreted in the richest eloquence of exalted emotion in that man as he stood over his unconscious wife, ministering to her, wild at heart to kiss her even once, but not denying himself. No, restrained by noble recognition of her rights as a woman whose heavenly offence was chastity, and of her command as his wife who was a virgin. After some little time she sighed, opened her eyes, looked at him with bewilderment, shivered like one suddenly awakened from sleep, and sitting up said, "What has happened to me? You are all right now. The heat overcame you. It is certainly very oppressive." He stepped to a sideboard and mingled a little brandy with some soda water. She drank, seated up, turning to her rich eyes to him, and thanking him with a smile which was lovely with its mingled colours of emotion, and as the nosegay is sweet and delightful by a variety of hue. "Do you feel better?" he asked, straight-jacketing the deep solicitude of his soul with the demeanour of a commonplace courtesy. "Much. It was the heat. You will send me an acknowledgment of the money?" "Oh yes, this evening." "Do you keep a banking account in Ramsgate?" "I have banked the money you sent me." "Then you will be able to deal with the cheque I gave you this afternoon." "I can ever be of service to you in any business or other direction you may indicate. I do beg that you will command my services." She thanked him and rose to go, stepping to the mantelpiece to adjust her hat and collar. "May I see you to the door?" "It is but a step." "Goodbye, Mr. Goodhart. Believe me sincerely grateful for all of your kindness." "Do not forget your flowers, Mrs. Reynolds." He watched her from the doorstep with anxiety until she entered her lodging-house. He paced his room, much harassed by thought. He could not bring himself into a resolution to confess the truth to her. Exhibitions of loyalty, of love, that in her as a wife wanted the consecrating element of amoriness, of gratitude, of contrition, these had been in sufficient abundance to furnish a basis for hope or even an incentive to action. Yet could not he persuade himself that if he pulled the mask off him, she would not shrink from the intimacy of wedded association as she had shrunk 8 years before. She might elude him by silently leaving the town, and he could not find will enough to determine him to take his chance and challenge a new repulse, a new insult, a new degradation to his feelings as a man and his rights as a husband. He smiled when he opened her acknowledgment of the cheque and kissed the signature. They met only once in the 6 days that followed. She had found work for an hour and a half in the afternoon, but he was careful not to lose his hold of her. Almost every day he reminded her of his existence by a gift, a box of peaches, a basket of strawberries, a bouquet of flowers. When he met her on the days preceding the last, which was to dawn fraught with the issue of a lifetime to this couple, she thanked him for his constant kindness. Indeed, she felt overwhelmed. His persistent goodness embarrassed her. She really had no claim upon him. Her manner was gracious, yet there was a constraint in it that was perceptible. It was indeed as though she had said to him, "I do not know if it is your intention to take advantage of my situation and the obligation you have placed me under to push kindness into persecution, but you have done so much that more must cease to be agreeable." Her meaning was as clearly intimated by her behaviour and speech as though she had pronounced it in the above words. There was a little coolness in the way she said good night to him. He exactly understood and took delight in what was passing in her mind, and he also judged, and rightly judged, that she was not drawn closer to Mr. Goodhart by his knowledge of her treatment of her husband. Came the 6th day following the afternoon in which Lucretia had drunk tea with Mr. Goodhart and received a cheque for £218. She had risen somewhat late. A slight headache had detained her in bed. She did not feel well enough to walk through the glaring heat of that July morning. It was about 10 o'clock when she left her room to teach 3 young girls whose parents lived at the westernmost extremity of the West Cliff. She sat at breakfast in a shabby parlour. Mr. Goodhart's yesterday's gift of flowers glowed on the little dingy chiffonier in which she kept her tea and sugar. A man was bawling fresh soles in the street, and his outcry through the open window was as distracting as though he was in the room. The gilt of the cheap mantel glass was carefully estranged by red muslin from the blow of the housefly. Lucretia's appetite was not invited by the plain boiled egg, which she neglected for a piece of toast and butter and a cup of tea. The postman knocked. The landlady, very weedy in widow's weeds, entered with a letter. It was addressed to her, and the first address had been to Chepstow Place. This had been erased, and the address of the office in which Dr. Lane had purchased an annuity substituted. This had been erased and replaced by the name and address of Wembley Jones, which in their turn had suffered eviction and yielded to 28 Bellevue Road, Ramsgate. The envelope bore the Valparaiso postmark and the Chilean stamp. A sudden sensation of tightness that made difficult the systole and diastole of the post came upon Lucretia's heart. She very well remembered that the South Pacific port to which the Flying Spur had sailed was not far distant from Valparaiso, and this, though as a matter of fact it was perfectly irrelevant as a stimulus to thought, quickened in her an hysterical, and as she seemed to feel it, and a frightening imagination that this letter was from her husband. Was the address in his handwriting? But in 8 years the handwriting of some, of many, will change, more or less. She opened the envelope. It enclosed a letter and an envelope containing a letter, the envelope addressed in pencil, to the Honourable Stranger. This envelope was pierced as though a nail had been passed through it. Her dark eyes took on a light and largeness of wonder with presence of alarm. The shadow inexpression of the dread of calamity, the look of fear that is in the gaze of one to whom the shape had come to depart no more. The letter ran thus: Ship Wildfire, Valparaiso, April 4, 1898. Dear Madam, I am the 3rd mate of this ship, which sailed from Liverpool for this port in December last year. We found ourselves becalmed off the island of Santa Cristo 3 weeks ago, and the captain sent me ashore to look for turtle and fruit. I found neither, but in overhauling the island I came across a cave in which was an old sea chest with the letter I enclosed nailed to its lid. I pulled out the nail and read the letter, but found that the bonds had been dug up, for a shovel lay close alongside the hole in which they had been buried. It was the hole right enough, for it was marked as Captain Reynolds describes. I guess he was rescued and took away the bonds himself, for I hunted right and left for anything like human remains, and if he had died upon the island he was bound in due course to become a skeleton, and there is no skeleton nor anything answering to a man's bones in that island. In a hollow not far from the cave is Mr. John Goodhart's grave, with a cross raised by your husband, as the inscription cut upon it proves. I thought it my duty to forward the enclosed, as you will naturally wish to hear about your husband, and trusting this letter may safely come in your hands. I am yours truly, Samuel Murdoch. With no more prophetic insight, with no more apprehension by intuition of the truth, whose blaze of light was suddenly to flood her, than had the letter she had held been a tradesman's bill, She took the enclosure from the envelope, curiously labelled "To the Honourable Stranger." The paper was very old, over 100 years old, yellow, stained, of coarse texture, a most singular piece of paper, which, with its scrawl of pencil, might, and could the dead write, be just such a letter as one might expect to receive from a dead man. You remember what Reynolds wrote? How, conceiving that he must be left to perish on the island, and his love for ever holding his wife in view, he, with Goodhart's gold pencil and an old roll of paper taken from the chest in the cave, framed the appeal to the Honourable Stranger, which Lucretia was now holding, and was now reading. Though it was but a scrawl, she knew the handwriting, and indeed it was contained in an envelope that she herself had addressed to him, but from which the ink had been washed by immersion when he was in the lifebelt. She read, her face blanched into marble whiteness. She read. The blood stormed in a red-hot torrent to the roots of her hair. She read and looked upwards and thought, "He is my husband. Had not I guessed it? Had not I suspected it in 20 shapes of look and speech and smile?" Again she read, and when she came to this part, she sobbed as if her heart must break. "My wife, Lucretia, when I left England, was living with her mother, Mrs. Lane, in Chepstow Place, Bayswater, London, W. And it is my earnest wish that she should be the recipient of these bonds and the property that may be found upon me. To which end I, a broken-hearted, desolate, dying man, humbly and affectionately greet the reader of this letter, and do entreat him, as he loves God and the truth and honour, to convey these words and the property to my wife, Lucretia Reynolds, who, for the trouble he is at in finding her, if she has removed, and in acting as my emissary, will receive £1,500, which he will more greatly enjoy as money honourably and virtuously gained than if he kept the whole sum, thereby robbing the widow and blasting the only hope which keeps warm and alive the heart that dictates these words. Again I greet and bless you and thank you for the noble services you will be doing me. Francis Reynolds. The truth was very clear to her now. Mr. Goodhart was her husband. It was her husband who had brought her the £150, not from the island, but as a gift from his love and loyalty. But oh, why had he waited all these years? Why had he not come sooner? It was her husband who had caused the bank to send a cheque for £218. He had dwelt near her, and brooded over her, and courted her as Goodhart, and her heart smiled in remembrance of her triumph in that. Why had he not come sooner? Why had he not revealed himself? Her instincts as a woman pierced to the very sanctuary where the truth was enshrined, and his motives were as intelligible to her as though he had explained them. She stood rooted in thought, with her eyes on the papers in her hands, then took pen and ink, sat down at the table and wrote, "My Frank, you are revealed to me by the enclosed. Come to me, come quickly and forgive me. Lucretia." She put this note and a letter she had received into an envelope which she addressed to John Goodhart, Esquire, and rang the bell. The landlady's daughter appeared. "Miss Simpkins, will you please run with this at once to Mr. Goodhart's lodgings?" The girl of 14 took the letter and vanished, and Lucretia from her window saw her rapidly walk to the house in Augusta Road, handing the letter, and leisurely return, for there were dishes to wash and beds to make, and the little Miss Simpkins was in no hurry. Reynolds was reading a London daily paper when the servant gave him Lucretia's letter. He read it and sprang to his feet, pausing for a moment in a swift distraction or delirium of reverie upon his letter, which he had written in the island, for into it swept with the velocity of sunshine the whole of that heavy term of ocean solitude, and for an instant the full picture was before him, with Goodhart's grave, and the cave, and the shovel, and the cookpit, just as at midnight the broad circle of the sea, or the hills and the plains of a face of country, are flashed into brilliance by a dart of lightning. He put on his cap, and in a minute or two had measured the distance that divided his own from Lucretia's lodgings. He knocked, was admitted, passed into the parlour, the door of which he closed, and stood cap in hand, looking at his wife. Manifestly, since sending to him, she had been struggling to school herself for this meeting. You saw that in her posture and demeanour as she stood at the table, which remained covered with the breakfast things. But the fragile foundations and props of a woman's resolution must sink under the weight of a woman's passion and emotion. She said, "Oh, Frank, I know you now. I see you in your changed face, and," but then the constricted chords in her throat refused to deliver the message of her mind. All on a sudden she sank down on her knees by the table, and hiding her face in her arm, wept and wept. He rushed to her side, fell upon his knees, and put his arm about her. He pressed his cheek to hers and murmured endearments, calling her his only love, his dear wife, his noble Lucretia. But it seemed that she would not have any of this just yet. For, rising in a blind way, she got round to the other side of the table, and he stood up with such a deadly chill of fear of her reception that for a space he remained and looked like a figure in stone. "Not yet, Frank, not yet," she exclaimed, extending her hands towards him, but in the posture of repulsion. "Mr. Featheridge told a lie when he wrote that I loathed you." "Loathed? Oh no, I loved you. I loathed myself. But something worked in me with a power that was stronger than love or loathing, and I could not. You violated that mad spirit in me that would have wasted itself had you given me time, had you gone your voyage, when you brought me by a falsehood to your ship. But I afterwards knew that, even when I silently left you at Falmouth, I was loving you as I had loved you when I accepted you, and I also knew that a power had worked in me which had made me false, but, oh Frank, more faithless to myself than to you." He moved as though to go to her, but her outstretched arms held him off. "But what was your love?" she continued. "You went away and have never written, never made a sign, never came home to see if I were alive and true to you. 8 years, and I have thought you dead. Otherwise I should have known you. Changed as you are the Frank I loved and married. I should have known you, and you have left me alone. When had you returned and sought me and claimed me, you would have found me your loyal wife, loving you, deploring you, accusing myself of a wickedness whose memory works in me in torment, and again, in thinking of you and recalling my conduct at our marriage, I could have destroyed myself." Her arms slowly fell to her sides. Her head sank. "Lucretia," he said in a low voice, whose tone thrilled with his love and the thoughts her words had excited, "I do not dare seek you because I dreaded your reception. I am a man, and you have the feelings of a man, and I feared you. You might have spurned me again. You might even yet spurn me." "No," she cried, and ran to him, and he folded her in his arms and pressed his lips upon hers, and thus they stood, husband and wife. End of chapter 16. Recording by Gary Ullman, West Palm Beach, Florida.